she's staring at.
Our second Tron game this week is Tron Maze-A-Tron, which also saw release in 1982 for the Intellivision system. And this Tron game is a maze game where you control not Tron but rather Flynn in his battle against the Master Control program. Maze-A-Tron has two phases for you to play, the first being an auto-scrolling segment where you navigate various computer circuit boards collecting zeros from minor chip things in order to purge the major RAM things from the MCP's control. Assuming you could get that done eventually, you move on to the second phase, which pits you against the Master Control program itself, where you must prevent the program from reinfecting the purged chips by shooting bits into the bit stream. Success here means you go to the next round and do the first phase all over again at a much higher level of difficulty, while failure does more of the same, basically. Yes. The idea, on paper at least, sounds neat. The execution, on the other hand... Yeah, so we previously looked at Tron Deadly Discs, and while I much prefer the simpler 2600 version over the Intellivision one, the controls see. I did concede that there was some fun to be had with Deadly Discs once you got that particular hurdle out of the way. I also mentioned that it was the best of the three Tron games to grace Intellivision, and Maze-A-Tron did very little to change that mindset. This is an absolutely joyless and utterly frustrating affair that is confounding to a new player because everything comes across as simply incomprehensible. And even once you figured out what you're supposed to do and how you're supposed to go about things, the alleviation of your suffering as a result of that newly gained knowledge is only marginal and very, very temporary. But let's stop with the padding. As previously stated, you have two phases of gameplay in Maze-A-Tron. Phase 1 has you controlling Flynn in a constantly scrolling computer circuit board where you have to collect zeros via these lock chip things and use them to clear the RAM chips of the Master Control program's influence, all the while avoiding lit fuses, passing recognizers, and the ever-present threat of being crushed by the scrolling torture of de-resolution. You have no weapons, but you do have a force shield that can be used to freeze recognizers in place, as well as let you pass through energy barriers. Force shields require energy, however, and there are certain transformer units that will let you recharge your energy reserves so long as you're mindful not to get crushed by the auto-scrolling bits. But there are also panels that let you switch the direction of the scrolling, as well as panels that let you warp to another part of the circuit board. Use of these warp panels is essential as there is a lot of circuit board for you to traverse, and throughout all of this you are constantly maintaining your energy levels high to power your force shield, as well as accumulating zeros for the purposes of purging the chips, which are all laid out together once you finally get to that point. Upon reaching the RAM chips, you'll need to enter each chip from the top and bottom to turn the binary number black, and if required, use your collected zeros to change from the 1 to a 0, thereby purging the MCP from the chip. Once all chips are purged, you're rewarded bonus points depending on the time it took for you to complete the phase, before moving on to the next phase of the game. In the second phase, you are up against the Master Control unit itself, and your main goal here is to shoot bits at numbers and the two inner bit stacks to freeze them in place. The idea here is to match the two inner bit numbers with the two outer bit numbers on the side. Every so often, the MCP will shoot projectiles at you that you could defend with your force shield, which thankfully has no energy limit in this mode, so you can raise that shield as often as you like. Take 3 hits and you're back to phase 1. Likewise, blow the stack and you're back to phase 1. Either way, you're back to phase 1 and a higher level of difficulty where you get to do the whole thing all over again. Right, so here's the thing with Maze-A-Tron. Conceptually, it's not a bad idea, having a little Kevin Flynn run around a bunch of circuit boards, avoiding recognizers and hazards and stuff to try and purge computer chips of malicious influence. Then you have a sort of a deal with the MCP. When it comes to the execution, though, that's when things start to fall apart, and a large part of Maze-A-Tron's issues comes down to a couple key factors. First off, and stop me if you've heard this before, but control is a bit of a sticking point. Controlling Flynn around up the board shouldn't be too much of a hassle if the disc plays nice and doesn't stick, which it will occasionally do. I do like that you can move about in 8 directions, which puts said disc to good use. However, it can be very easy to get stuck in walls or bits of scenery, and there are even occasions where I would try to run around a corner and be stuck by some invisible force waiting to be killed by an incoming recognizer from out of nowhere. This is also the cause of numerous scrolling-related deaths. You do have a stop function that will freeze the auto-scrolling for a couple seconds, but this costs energy, and given that you need energy for your force shield, you may or may not want to constantly abuse this, especially if each pause is very brief. Secondly, and as previously alluded to, there is a lot of circuit board for you to traverse in this game. Apparently there's 4 different layouts, and you do have occasional IO/warp boards that you could enter and take you across the various boards that will eventually lead you on course to the RAM chips that you need to purge. The good news is that the layouts for these boards are never randomized. The first board will always be laid out in the same fashion, so in theory, you could map out or memorize the proper path to take. The bad news is that while there are plenty of boards, there are very few screen layouts, and therefore, especially as anyone familiar with the early NES fare would be well aware of, there is considerable screen recycling at work here to create the various board layouts. So you're constantly repeating screens every so often to such a degree that will make you think you're running in circles. Even worse, the warps are always randomized and you'll never know where you'll end up. Sometimes a warp board will warp you a couple screens away from the chips in question, while another time that same board could warp you someplace else. It really boils down to random chance, and considering a lot of the terrain gets recycled constantly, it becomes very difficult to gain some bearings on your overall surroundings. And this ultimately contributes to Maze-A-Tron's biggest issue. It is straight up boring as hell. The longer I am constantly navigating these mazes, the more frustrated I become in revisiting the same screens over and over again with no end in sight. Even when you reach the RAM chips, you only have a limited time to purge as many of the chips as possible due to the constant scrolling. And while there is one panel to switch the scrolling on one end to make life easier so you can make another pass, there's no such panel on the other end, which means more maze to traverse until you find said panel. And well, the chances of you purging all those chips in one pass is fairly minimal. It's possible, but extremely difficult. Now, once you've cleared the first phase, you move on to the second phase. Though, in an act of mercy, or something or other, Maze-A-Tron does feature a practice mode that lets you play the second phase immediately. That being the battle with the Master Control program and the shooting of the bits, which is no better than the first phase, sadly. Moving the cursor around with a disc is a touchy affair. Your shots have to land on the numbers exactly or else they won't register as a hit. The buttons aren't always the most responsive, and again, the whole thing is just full-blown tedium. I mean, hey, it looks cool. The MCP face is kind of menacing, and the general layout, while somewhat confusing, is kind of neat looking. But yeah, I don't know, this doesn't work for me, brother. I suppose I should list some positives, and the best place would be the graphics, which are competently executed all things considered. The overall look of the circuit board is rather clean and simple looking, but kind of cool to look at as a visual. Flynn is your stock Intellivision running man, but the recognizers and master control program wall do look the parts and are quite menacing for low-tech stuff. The scrolling is also quite smooth, which shouldn't be too much of a surprise on Intellivision, but still worth a mention, especially on the fastest setting where it's nice and slick. Sounds a bit of a mixed bag of sorts. There's a constant static hum in the background as you're playing, which is a nice ambience of sorts, and there's the loud trademark Intellivision beeps and bloops that are of the more irritating vintage rather than the rare charming ones. Admittedly, this is more of a mileage varying thing, and it's something you had to put up with when playing this platform in general, but it seemed more annoying here somehow. Probably because Maze-A-Tron's dreadfulness permeates all aspects of life. And, well, yeah, not much else to say here. Maze-A-Tron is dreadful. You've got a game with an interesting premise marred by poor execution and even poor controls. I wish I could say this makes for a decent sleep aid, but there are far easier ways of curing your insomnia, let me tell you. But yeah, this was pretty bad, and I'd have to say so far this is the worst Intellivision experience I've come across, which is sad, all things considered, because it hasn't really been all that bad up to this point. Sure, there was the occasional weak title like Empire Strikes Back, which Actually, it may have been the only real weak point if I'm being honest, but there were genuinely enjoyable titles I've played on the Intellivision. Just last week, I've played one of the system's best titles in the form of B-17 Bomber. And now here we are with Maze-A-Tron, which, yeah, no good, no buys, rubbish, delete program, run ribbon. And we still have another one of these things to look at. And it's a milestone review on top of that, 1100. So, goody. I'm going to bed. Good night.